A locked door, two ticking clocks, and a murder no one can explain. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where are you watching from? I can't wait to read your comments. Let's begin. It was one of those damp Paris geese mornings when the rain could not decide whether to fall or to linger in the air, and the city seemed wrapped in a grey shawl. The embankments of the Seine glistened faintly under a thin drizzle, and the yellow glow of the street lamps had not yet surrendered to the pale daylight. Chief Inspector Maigret sat at his usual corner table at the Brasserie Dauphine, a short walk from Quai des Orfèvres. His heavy overcoat was folded on the bench beside him, and the collar of his dark jacket bore a few beads of rain. He had been there nearly an hour, smoking slowly, refilling his pipe, and watching the passers-by through the steamy window. Madam. Maigret had scolded him gently that morning for leaving the house so early with only coffee in his stomach. She had offered him fried eggs, but he had shaken his head, saying only that he felt like stretching his legs before the day began. It wasn't entirely true. What he sought was not movement, but the mood of the city, its silence before the noise, its faces before the masks were properly fixed. The waiter, who knew him well, brought a fresh pot of coffee without being asked. Maigret nodded in thanks and poured himself another cup, adding a small measure of brandy from the glass beside it. His pipe smoke curled upward, merging with the faint smell of wet wool and damp umbrellas. He wasn't thinking of any particular case. There were files waiting at his office, reports typed in stiff bureaucratic prose, but they could wait. The moment. His thoughts drifted idly. He noticed the shoeshine boy outside, standing under the awning, stamping his feet to keep warm. A woman passed with her little terrier wrapped in a knitted coat, the dog looking more pampered than its mistress. Maigret sighed, not unhappily. These small details, unimportant to most, were to him the pulse of Paris. It was then that the telephone rang behind the counter. The waiter glanced at him before answering, lowering his voice as though it might disturb the inspector's morning calm. But Maigret had already turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. The waiter nodded once or twice, listening, then placed the receiver down with exaggerated care. "Inspector," he said softly, approaching the table. "It's the duty officer at the quay. He asks if you might come at once. Something peculiar has happened." Maigret tamped down the tobacco in his pipe with his thumb and looked out at the misted window again, as if the grey light might tell him whether this day would prove ordinary or not. Did he say what it was? The waiter hesitated. "A locked room," he mentioned, "and 2 clocks. Maigret gave no reaction. He finished his coffee, placed a few coins on the table, and rose heavily, buttoning his coat. As he stepped outside into the drizzle, he felt no urgency, only that quiet tug of curiosity that always came when the ordinary world showed a small crack. The Seine flowed silently beside him as he walked toward Quai des Orfèvres. The rain picked up, tapping on his hat brim, and Maigret drew on his pipe, his thoughts calm but alert. Somewhere behind a locked door with 2 clocks, something waited to be understood. Maigret reached Quai des Orfèvres, with his hat brim dripping, his overcoat damp and heavy from the steady drizzle that had gathered momentum during his walk. Inside, the familiar smell of wet paper, ink, and the faint acrid smoke of cheap cigarettes clung to the corridors. A uniformed sergeant nodded as he passed, and Maigret returned the gesture without breaking stride. He was in no rush, yet his steps were steady, purposeful. He had learned long ago that it was better to let the weight of a situation meet him slowly, like mist settling on one's shoulders. On the first floor, Inspector Janvier waited near the telephone room, cap in hand. His expression somewhere between embarrassment and puzzlement. Maigret removed his pipe from his pocket, as though that small ritual might put Janvier more at ease. "You called me out of the rain, my boy," Maigret said, his voice quiet, carrying neither reproach nor impatience. "What is it that's so peculiar?" Janvier hesitated. "It's a small boarding house on Rue Saint-Louis-en-Lille. The concierge rang the police this morning. She says one of her tenants didn't come down all yesterday nor this morning. No sound, no movement. When she tried the door, it was locked from the inside." "A locked door," Maigret murmured, tamping tobacco into his pipe with his thumb. Janvier nodded. The men forced it. They found him dead inside. A Monsieur Renault, retired clerk, lived alone, nothing remarkable, no sign of struggle. The window was shut tight and the only key was in the lock on the inside. Maigret drew on his pipe, but did not light it. His eyes, half-lidded, seemed to wander past Janvier to the wet pane of the corridor window. "And the clocks?" he asked. "That's the odd part," Janvier said, lowering his voice, though no one was near. There were 2 clocks in the room, both on the mantelpiece, identical. One read 3:10, the other 3:05. Both stopped. For a moment, Maigret neither moved nor spoke. The rain ticked faintly against the glass. Finally, he slipped the pipe back into his pocket. "Let's go," he said. The ride in the police car was short, the tires hissing against the wet cobblestones. Paris looked blurred, as though painted in watercolors by an unsteady hand. Crossing the Pont de la Tournelle, Maigret watched the Seine churning below, swollen with autumn rain. He leaned back, drawing the lapels of his coat closer, and let the silence of the car cradle his thoughts. The boarding house was a modest building, grey and narrow, wedged between a grocer's shop and a shuttered bakery. A policeman stood at the entrance, his boots leaving damp marks on the worn stone steps. He saluted, stepping aside as Maigret and Janvier entered. The concierge, a stout woman with sharp eyes, hovered in the dim hallway, wringing her hands on her apron. Her hair was pinned untidily, and she smelled faintly of onions. She greeted them with a mix of relief and fear, whispering too quickly, "I knew something was wrong, Monsieur Inspector. Monsieur Renault never missed his morning walk, always at 8 o'clock sharp without fail. Yesterday, nothing. And this morning again, silence. I knocked and knocked, not a sound. He was so regular, like the clocks themselves." Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Janvier as if for confirmation that her fears had been justified. Maigret merely nodded. He followed her up the narrow staircase, listening to the creak of the boards and the muffled sounds of tenants behind closed doors. Life went on in the building, even as the smell of something unspoken seeped into its walls. The room was on the 2nd floor, facing the street. A uniformed officer stood aside as Maigret entered. The air inside was heavy, tinged with the faint smell of gas and old fabric. Curtains half drawn made the light dim and uneven. Monsieur Renault lay in bed, still under the covers, as though he had gone to sleep and simply failed to wake. His face was pale, the features slack, one hand resting. Outside the blanket, there was no blood, no visible wound, nothing violent in his departure. But the eye was drawn, inevitably, to the mantelpiece. 2 clocks, nearly identical, brass-framed with white enamel dials, stood side by side. Both hands, frozen, one at 3:10, the other at 3:05. Maigret stood near the bed, his hands deep in his coat pockets, pipe unlit between his teeth. He didn't move for a long time. His eyes wandered over the furniture, a small desk with orderly stacks of paper, a chair neatly tucked under it, slippers placed side by side at the foot of the bed. Everything spoke of habit, of precision. Finally he turned to Janvier. "Who found him?" "The men who broke the door after the concierge called. No one's touched anything since." Maigret nodded, approaching the mantelpiece. He bent slightly, examining the clocks, then straightened, his large frame filling the small room. He neither spoke nor gestured for several moments, simply breathing in the atmosphere. It was not the silence of death that pressed on him, but another silence, heavier, more personal. The kind of silence that lingers when something has been concealed. With care, the concierge hovered in the doorway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He was a quiet man, Monsieur Inspector, always polite, always punctual, paid his rent on the 1st of the month, never caused trouble, but? Maigret prompted gently, his tone almost fatherly. She hesitated, cheeks reddening. "There were sometimes visitors, not often, but enough for me to notice. A younger woman, perhaps 30. She came in the afternoons, never stayed long. He said she was a cousin, but she didn't look like family to me." Maigret made no remark. He turned once more to the 2 clocks, the brass reflecting the weak daylight like dull eyes. He drew his pipe from his mouth and rubbed the bowl slowly with his thumb. Janvier broke the silence. "It looks like natural causes, Chief. A heart attack, perhaps. And the clocks, well, it could just be coincidence." Maigret gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though his eyes remained fixed on the mantel. "Coincidences," he said softly, "are like shadows. They tell us something is standing in the light, just out of sight." He let the words hang there. Outside, a cart rattled over the cobblestones, and the concierge cleared her throat nervously. Maigret finally moved toward the bed, pulling the blanket a little higher over the dead man's chest, a small gesture of respect. Then he turned back to the clocks. Something about them, their twin silence, seemed to whisper a question he could not yet put into words. And as he stood there, heavy, calm, almost motionless, it was clear to everyone in the room that the case had only just begun. Maigret remained in the small room longer than the others expected, his presence filling it without words. He lit his pipe at last, and the familiar smell of burning tobacco mixed with the musty air. Smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling. He stood still, eyes half closed, as though he were not studying the scene, but letting the scene itself seep into him. Nothing moved except the faint twitch of his thumb against the stem of his pipe. Finally he turned toward Janvier. "We'll speak to the tenants, not all at once, quietly, one by one." His voice was low, as though he were careful not to disturb the silence of the room. The concierge led them back to the landing, grateful to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Maigret followed slowly, pausing on the stairs as he glanced at the worn banister polished by countless hands. The building smelled faintly of cabbage, boiled potatoes, and damp laundry drying behind closed doors. It was the ordinary life of Paris pressed together under one roof. The first tenant to answer was a middle-aged man in shirt-sleeves, hair flattened as if he had just risen from a nap. He was a clerk, his fingers stained with ink, his manner cautious. He spoke of Renaud as a neighbor he barely knew, polite greetings on the stairs, nothing more. He kept to himself, the man said, rubbing his palms nervously together. Very regular. Every morning the same hour, every evening the same walk. You could set your own watch by him. Maigret asked few questions. He stood near the doorway, nodding occasionally, puffing at his pipe. The clerk began filling the silence with details, as people often did in his presence. How Renaud always bought his bread from the baker across the street, how he disliked strong smells and once complained of onions frying too late in the evening, how he never raised his voice. The portrait that emerged was of a man precise, orderly, yet somehow fragile in his solitude. When they left, Maigret made no comment. He gestured toward the next apartment. A young couple lived there, the husband, a mechanic, the wife with tired eyes from caring for a newborn. She whispered so as not to wake the child, speaking of Monsieur Renaud with respect, almost pity. "He always tipped his hat to me. Sometimes he looked lonely, like someone waiting for news that never came." Maigret lingered at that remark, his eyes resting on her face, but he asked nothing more. They continued this way, room by room, listening to fragments of ordinary life threaded with the dead man's name. Each tenant repeated the same refrain, polite, punctual, a man of habit. None admitted knowing him well. He was part of the building's routine, as fixed as the ticking of a clock in the background. But it was when they returned to the concierge's, lodged downstairs, that something shifted. She had been waiting for them, perched on her chair behind the counter, her hands still restless in her lap. Her eyes flicked nervously toward Maigret as he entered. "You said earlier, madame, that a woman visited him," Maigret reminded gently, lowering himself into the wooden chair opposite her desk. The concierge licked her lips. "Yes, not often. Once every 2 weeks, perhaps. Always in the afternoon, never at night. She was well dressed, a little too well for this quarter. Gloves, hat, perfume. She didn't belong here." "Did you speak to her?" "Only good day. Good evening. She wasn't the sort to chat." "And Monsieur Renaud, did he ever speak of her?" "Never. He was discreet. But—" She hesitated, eyes darting to Janvier before returning to Maigret. "One evening after she left, I found him standing in the hallway, just standing there staring at nothing. He looked pale, almost shaken. When he saw me, he straightened up and nodded as if nothing were wrong. But I remember. It was different that time." Maigret nodded slowly. His pipe had gone out. He made no effort to relight it. He watched her in silence until she shifted uneasily. At last he rose, thanking her with a small inclination of his head, and stepped back outside with Janvier. The rain had eased to a fine mist, the kind that clung to the skin like a damp veil. Across the street, the grocer stacked crates of apples, their red skins glowing faintly under the gas lamp. A delivery cart rattled by, and the driver gave the inspector a curious glance, unaware of the quiet weight of the investigation unfolding behind the narrow facade. Janvier finally broke the silence. "It still looks like a natural death, Chief. The doctors will confirm. Maybe the clocks were just faulty." Maigret didn't answer. He walked slowly toward the corner cafe, the soles of his shoes scraping against the wet stones. Inside, the smell of coffee and tobacco embraced them. He chose a table by the window, ordered a calvados, and sat with his heavy shoulders rounded, staring at the reflections of rain on the pavement outside. Janvier waited, accustomed to his chief's silences. Maigret finally spoke, almost to himself. "A man like that doesn't receive visits from a young woman without reason. He was not rich, not handsome, not adventurous, and yet she came. Regularly." "What does that mean?" Janvier shrugged. "Perhaps a relative, after all." Maigret shook, his head faintly. "No. Relatives talk, neighbors know. But no one knew her. She belonged to him only in secrecy. And secrecy weighs on a man. He cannot hide it completely. It seeps out in his gestures, his silences." He drank slowly, savoring the burn of the calvados. Outside, the grocer locked his shop and disappeared into the mist. The city seemed wrapped in a hush as though listening. "The clocks," Maigret said at last, his eyes on the wet glass. "They stopped at almost the same time, not by chance. Two clocks do not die together without a reason. And if someone wanted us to see them side by side, both silent..." He let the thought trail off, unfinished. Janvier leaned forward, curious, but Maigret only shook his head. "We'll wait for the report from the doctor, and in the meantime, we'll find out who this woman is. She holds the thread." Janvier nodded, already reaching for his notebook. But Maigret remained still, watching the faint figures moving under umbrellas outside, the rain painting halos around the lamps. He felt it again, that quiet unease, the sense of a life shaped by habit and secrecy, broken not by violence but by something subtler, more human. And somewhere, just out of reach, the truth lingered like the smoke from his extinguished pipe. Waiting for the right moment to be drawn into the light, Maigret stayed at the café longer than necessary, finishing his calvados in small, deliberate sips. The mist beyond the glass seemed to thicken, softening the shapes of passers-by until they became shadows with umbrellas. He refilled his pipe and lit it this time, the flame briefly reflecting in his tired eyes. Janvier kept glancing at him, waiting for instructions, though he knew from experience that they would come not as commands but as quiet observations, sometimes hours late, as if born from the smoke itself. When Maigret finally spoke, it was in his unhurried tone, his gaze, still fixed outward. "You'll ask around discreetly, Janvier. The baker across the street, the grocer, even the postman. Someone has seen her. She did not arrive or leave invisibly." Janvier nodded, already half rising. "Not tonight," Maigret added. "Tomorrow. People will speak more easily in the daylight. Tonight, we let them imagine the police are gone." He settled the matter with that, and Janvier sank back into his chair. The quiet hum of the café wrapped around them, cups clinking, low voices, the rustle of newspapers. For a time, Maigret looked no different from any weary Parisian finishing his evening brandy after a damp day. When they left, the streets were slick and nearly deserted. A stray cat slipped across their path, pausing to lick the rain from its paw. At the corner, Janvier saluted and made his way toward the metro, while Maigret continued slowly on foot, turning his collar up against the drizzle. He crossed the Seine once more, its dark water swollen and restless, and eventually reached his apartment where the warm light from the kitchen window awaited him. Madame Maigret had kept supper warm. She said nothing about his lateness, merely set the dish before him, watching with her usual mild patience as he ate without real appetite. She talked of trivialities, the neighbor's illness, a letter from her sister in Alsace, but at one point she remarked casually, The clock in the sitting room stopped again this afternoon. I wound it, but an hour later it had lost time. I suppose the spring is nearly finished. Maigret looked up briefly, his spoon hovering, though she had not meant anything by it. He only murmured, "Yes, springs do wear out," before returning to his plate. Later in bed, he lay awake longer than his wife, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled drip of rain against the shutters. The image of the two clocks on Renaud's mantelpiece returned again and again, their silent dials, watching him like eyes that would not close. The next morning he rose earlier than usual and reached the quay before most of his men. The doctor's report awaited him on his desk. Heart failure, sudden but not violent. No trace of poison, no external injury. Death around 3 in the morning, though the exact minute could not be certain. Maigret read it twice, slowly. Then he placed it aside, not surprised, and began filling his pipe. Janvier arrived with his coat still wet from the mist. "I've spoken with the baker and the grocer," he reported briskly. "Both saw her, the woman. The baker says she bought a loaf once while waiting for Monsieur Renaud. The grocer recalls her buying fruit, apples, always apples. He remembers because she insisted on choosing them herself, very particular. He thought she might be an actress, or someone from better quarters than ours." "Did he hear her name?" "No. But he remembers her asking once if Renaud liked them ripe or still firm, as though she didn't quite know his habits." Maigret exhaled smoke, thoughtful. "A woman who buys apples for a man she visits secretly. Not a cousin, not likely a niece, perhaps—" He did not finish. He rose heavily from his chair, shrugged into his coat, and gestured for Janvier to follow. They walked again to Rue Saint-Louis-en-l'Île. The morning air cold, the streets shining after the night's rain. The concierge looked weary but alert when they entered the lodge. She hurried to offer details, eager to prove her usefulness. "You're looking for her, aren't you?" "A young lady. I can tell you she always left quickly with her head down as if afraid of being seen." "Did she always come alone?" Maigret asked. "Always. Though once—" The concierge frowned, searching her memory. "Once I thought I saw her pause outside, looking back down the street, as if someone had followed her. But when I opened the door, she smiled quickly and came in. Perhaps it was nothing." Maigret thanked her, then asked for Renaud's key, now in police custody. He wanted to see the apartment once more, not with a crowd of officers but in silence. The room was just as they had left it, except the body was gone. The air felt clearer, though the absence was as heavy as the presence had been. He moved slowly through the small space, his broad shoulders brushing against the furniture. He touched the slippers at the bed's foot, still aligned neatly. He opened the desk drawer, rows of bills, receipts, and letters stacked in order, all ordinary, painfully ordinary, yet he could not ignore the two clocks still resting on the mantel. Both had been taken for examination, then returned. They stared at him, mute, each with its hands frozen at that early hour of death. Why two? Why identical? He leaned closer, examining the brass frames. One bore a faint scratch across its base, the other did not. He imagined the man buying them, perhaps years ago, or receiving them as a gift. A single clock was enough for a room. Two seemed deliberate, though not explained. He lowered himself into the chair, pipe in hand, and let the silence speak. He could almost see the man's last hours, the ritual of undressing, folding clothes, sliding into bed. Did he glance at the clocks before sleep? Did he wait for her visit that day and find only absence? Maigret sat without moving until the room's stillness pressed into him like damp air. Finally he rose, his knees creaking, and closed the door carefully behind him. On the stairs, a tenant passed carrying a newspaper, nodding politely without curiosity. Life continued, indifferent. Outside, the sky brightened faintly, a dull silver behind torn clouds. Janvier waited at the corner, stamping his feet against the cold. Maigret joined him, saying nothing at first. They stood together watching the street awaken, a milk cart rattling, children with school satchels, a lamplighter extinguishing the last gas flame. Only after several minutes did Maigret speak. "We'll find her. Not through the neighbors. To know too little. But the shops, the streets, and Paris is full of eyes. Someone has seen her often enough to give us more. Janvier nodded, notebook ready. Maigret began walking slowly, his coat collar turned up, his pipe smoke trailing behind. Him. He carried with him the image of 2 silent clocks and a man whose routine had cracked under the weight of something private. There was no hurry. The truth he felt would surface as it always did, not through force but by waiting, listening, letting others reveal themselves, and as he moved down the wet street, the faint smell of apples seemed to follow him, mingling with the damp air of Paris. The morning moved forward with its usual indifference, though Maigret felt that faint tightening in his chest that told him the case was beginning to breathe on its own. He and Janvier crossed the bridge again, the Seine gleaming dully under the pale light, and returned to the quay. Files were waiting on his desk, neat stacks prepared by clerks who believed in order, but he set them aside. The faint trace of apples still lingered in his thoughts, like a scent carried from another room. He summoned Lucas, another of his inspectors, and gave instructions with the quiet authority that brooked no fuss. A woman, 30 or so, well-dressed, frequent visitor to Rue Saint-Louis-en-Lille. Ask among the cafes nearby, the tram stops, the newspaper kiosk. She bought fruit. She may have taken the tram. She may have spoken a word or two. Don't press too hard. People remember better when they are allowed to talk at their own pace. Lucas nodded and left immediately, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Maigret tamped his pipe, then rose. He disliked staying in the office, when the air of Paris itself seemed to carry more clues than all the typewritten reports combined. He decided to revisit the baker across from the boarding house, not with questions but with presence. The baker was in his shop, sleeves rolled, face ruddy from the oven. He greeted the inspector with polite nervousness, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron. "Monsieur Inspector, yes, I saw her often, always in the afternoon. She walked quickly, as if she didn't want to be noticed. But one notices, of course, a woman like that, dressed so fine in this quarter." Maigret leaned against the counter, not pressing, his eyes on the baskets of warm bread. The baker continued, as if needing to justify his observation. "She was particular about her gloves, always pale, not worn. And she never bought more than 1 loaf at a time, always the small one. She paid with coins, exact change." "Did she speak of Monsieur Renaud?" Maigret asked softly. The baker shook his head. "Never. She only said good day, but I felt, how to put it, she was not indifferent. She seemed tense, as if every minute she stood here was dangerous." Maigret thanked him and left with a baguette under his arm, more for the gesture than hunger. On the street he chewed the inside of his cheek. People so careful, so precise, always left a trace nonetheless. The baker's remark about tension clung to him more than the description of gloves or coins. By midday he returned to the quay, where Lucas was waiting with his report. The kiosk vendor near the bridge remembered her clearly. She bought newspapers twice a week, always the same, the popular illustrated one. She never lingered, but once she asked if the issue contained the serial about a young girl who runs away from home. She seemed very intent on it. Maigret puffed slowly on his pipe, a woman with good gloves, apples in her hands, reading stories of runaways, pieces of a puzzle whose image he could not yet see. In the afternoon, he walked once more to Rue Saint-Louis-en-Lille, this time alone. He wanted to feel the building without the distraction of colleagues. The concierge, seeing him, opened her mouth to speak, but he lifted a hand gently, asking for silence. He climbed the stairs at his own pace, pausing on each landing, breathing in the smells of cooking, laundry, dust. Behind each door life carried on, unaware of the inspector's slow ascent. At Renaud's door he stopped. The lock had been repaired, the wood still scarred from the force used to open it. He stood there, heavy and still, as if listening to what remained in the walls. The silence was not empty. It was thick, as if words had been spoken there too often in whispers. He descended again, this time pausing at the concierge's lodge. She could not hold back her curiosity. "Monsieur Inspector, do you think he was killed?" Maigret shook his head slightly. "I think he died of what was in him already, but what was in him may have been heavier than most men can bear." She looked puzzled, but he offered no more. He stepped out into the late afternoon light, the drizzle returning with fine persistence. That evening he sat once more at the Brasserie Dauphine. The waiter placed his calvados without asking. The inspector's pipe smoked gently as he watched the damp figures moving outside. He thought of Renaud, precise and punctual, folding his clothes before bed, his life measured by clocks. And he thought of the woman with apples, whose visits were short and sharp like a blade. Madame Maigret joined him later, having finished errands. She slipped into the seat opposite with a sigh, brushing raindrops from her sleeve. She did not ask about the case. She never did. Instead, she told him that the butcher had raised prices again, and that the neighbor's son was courting a girl who seemed too flighty. Maigret listened, nodding, but at one point her words touched something. "The neighbor," she said, "always complains his clock never runs properly since he moved it from the kitchen to the sitting room. He says some places suit clocks, others don't. I told him it's nonsense, but you know men." Maigret smiled faintly, but his eyes darkened. 2 clocks, in the same place, both stopping almost together. Was it nonsense or deliberate? A gesture. Perhaps not to tell time but to fix it. An hour chosen, preserved. He said nothing to his wife, only walked her home later, arm linked with hers. In their apartment he kissed her cheek goodnight and sat by the window long after she slept, pipe in hand, watching the lights of Paris dim one by one. In his mind, the image of the woman with the apples grew clearer. He could almost see her face now, though he had never been given its full description. A face that carried tension, secrecy, perhaps guilt. And behind her, always, the figure of Renaud, pale and orderly, waiting like a man who had set his clocks. Not for the passing of hours, but for the silence that followed. The truth was not yet visible, but Maigret felt it drawing nearer, like a faint sound heard through walls. All it required was patience. People revealed themselves in time, just as clocks revealed their faults when one waited long enough. He refilled his pipe, and with the steady rhythm of smoke curling upward, he let the night stretch on, knowing the investigation was beginning to take its true shape. The following morning, Paris was washed in a pale, uncertain light, the kind that made the streets look damp, even after the rain had stopped. Maigret left his apartment early, his hat pulled low, his shoulders already hunched as though bracing himself against a day not yet begun. He felt the heaviness of the case still on him, though no crime had been proven, no charges suggested. Yet there was something stubborn in the silence of that small room on Rue Saint-Louis-en-Lille, something that refused to let him pass on to other matters. At the quay he found Lucas waiting, with the eagerness of a man who wanted to bring something concrete. He held his notes like a schoolboy ready with his lesson. "I may have something, Chief. The kiosk vendor was right. I spoke with a tram conductor on line 86. He remembers a woman matching the description. Always boarded at Pont de Sully, always got off near Bastille, not every day but regularly. And once, he recalls, she dropped an apple from her bag. She picked it up quickly, but the image stayed with him." Maigret grunted softly, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. "Near Bastille, you say? That gives her a direction at least." Lucas nodded. He thinks she lived that way. He remembers because she never travelled beyond that stop. Maigret puffed on his pipe, then removed it, frowning slightly. "We'll walk there." "Not today, not yet. People notice when policemen go sniffing too soon, but she has left traces. She will appear again." He dismissed Lucas with a nod, then spent the rest of the morning at his desk, though his eyes often drifted to the window. Outside, the Seine flowed implacably, barges sliding past like shadows of another world. He thought again of the 2 clocks, their frozen faces fixed in the early hours. Why would a man own 2 identical clocks? To ensure punctuality? Or had they belonged to someone else, placed there as tokens, reminders? He imagined Renaud glancing at them in the half-light, waiting for the inevitable moment when their silence became permanent. By noon he returned to the boarding house, alone this time. The concierge gave him a look of mingled deference and fear as he entered. He offered her a brief nod, then climbed the stairs without speaking. The room was unchanged. Dust had begun to settle on the mantel, but the clocks were still there, mute companions, Maigret sat in the same chair he had occupied before, his great frame sinking heavily into the wood. He relit his pipe, filling the room with the scent of tobacco, and let his gaze travel over the familiar details. Something in the orderliness troubled him more now than before. Men who live alone grow careless in small ways. A shirt draped on a chair, a newspaper left unfolded, a dish not immediately washed. But here, everything was exact, aligned, as though prepared for someone else's eyes. It was the tidiness of anticipation, not of solitude. He rose and examined the desk more carefully. Letters, yes, but all official, receipts, bills, nothing personal. Not a postcard, not a note in a familiar hand. He frowned. A man visited by a woman with gloves and perfume, yet no trace of her. Ever left behind. That was absence as deliberate as presence. Descending again, he paused at the concierge's window. She straightened quickly. "Monsieur Inspector." "Did she ever come at night?" he asked, his tone flat, almost weary. The concierge hesitated, then shook her head. "No, always afternoons. Never later than 6. She came like someone who borrowed time." Maigret looked at her a long moment, then left without another word. He walked slowly back toward the river, the street alive now, with shopkeepers arranging their wares, children shrieking as they chased each other. At the fruit stand on the corner, he stopped. The vendor, a thin man with quick eyes, recognized him immediately. "You're looking into Monsieur Renaud, eh?" "Yes, I saw her too. She bought apples here, always red ones, never green. She touched them carefully, as if testing them like jewels." Maigret nodded, selecting one himself. He turned it in his thick fingers, feeling its smooth skin. "Did she speak of him?" "No, but she asked once if I thought they would keep fresh until the next day." I said yes. She smiled, but it was a sad smile, the sort of smile of someone who knows the answer already. He paid for the apple and continued his walk, biting into it as he went. The taste was sharp, a little bitter, not quite ripe. He chewed slowly, reflecting. She bought them not for herself then. They were for Renaud. She did not know his tastes, or she pretended not to know. Either way, the apples had been her gesture, her small thread of connection to a man who otherwise seemed to live in silence. Back at the quay that evening, the office buzzed with the routine of other cases. Clerks, carrying papers, typewriters clattering, but Maigret remained apart, smoking in his chair, staring at nothing. The others knew better than to interrupt when he was in that state. At dusk, Janvier returned with new information. "We've traced her further, Chief. A seamstress on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine remembers her well. She had a coat altered. They're fine material, expensive, paid in cash. The seamstress says she looked nervous, always in a hurry, but polite. She gave no name but left an address slip with the coat. The seamstress still has it." Maigret raised his head at last. "And?" Janvier hesitated. "The address is false. A building that was torn down 2 years ago." The inspector's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He drew deeply on his pipe, exhaling slowly, the smoke curling like the thoughts in his mind. A woman with gloves, apples, and no name. A man with 2 clocks, both stopped at nearly the same moment. Secrecy on both sides, intersecting in a room where silence now reigned. "Tomorrow," Maigret said at last, his voice quiet. "We go to Bastille, the tram stop. We watch. She may come again. If she's not foolish, she will stay away, but people are rarely as cautious as they think." He let the matter rest there. When the office emptied and the lamps burned low, he remained at his desk, hands folded over his stomach, pipe long extinguished. In his mind he saw again the faint smile of the fruit vendor, describing the woman's sadness. He saw Renaud's bed, its covers smooth, the slippers placed neatly side by side. He saw the clocks, their hands fixed forever in the hour of death, and beneath it all he felt the slow pulse of something human, loneliness perhaps, or longing, that had drawn them together and then left one of them lifeless in a room too tidy to be true. He rose at last, stretched his weary frame and prepared to go home, knowing that the waiting would soon end, that the woman and her apples would not remain in the shadows much longer. The following morning broke grey and heavy, the sky hanging, low as if pressing down on the roofs of Paris. Maigret arrived at the quay earlier than usual, his pipe already lit, the smoke curling around him as though to keep the damp air at bay. He said little to anyone, only nodded and took his usual place. Lucas, Janvier and the others came in gradually, and by the time the lamps were still faintly glowing in the early light, they all knew where the day would take them. Bastille. Maigret led them himself, walking at a measured pace that seemed unhurried but did not allow for delay. The city was stirring around them, vendors calling, shutters clattering open, the clop of a delivery horse on cobblestones. When they reached the tram stop, he positioned Lucas discreetly near the kiosk, Janvier a little further down the boulevard, while he himself took a place at the corner cafe, seating himself with his back to the wall and a view of the street. He ordered a coffee and let his heavy hands rest on the small table, the cup dwarfed between them. For hours they waited. Trams came and went, spilling workers, clerks, women with baskets, men with hats pulled low. Maigret's gaze swept the flow, steadily but without strain. His pipe smouldered, his coffee cooled, and the rhythm of the crowd became almost hypnotic. Yet his attention did not falter. He was listening for something, some slight discord in the ordinary music of the street. It was near 11 when she appeared. She came quietly, almost timidly, moving as though she hoped not to be noticed yet expecting to be. The gloves were there, pale against the dark of her coat. She carried a small bag, and in her other hand a folded umbrella, though no rain threatened. Her face was composed, but Maigret caught in it the same sadness described by the fruit vendor. She paused by the tram schedule, her eyes glancing not at the paper, but at the passing crowd as though measuring the space around her. Maigret did not move. He drew once on his pipe, then lowered it, the stem resting against his palm. Lucas, alert, shifted slightly at the kiosk, but Maigret gave no signal. They let her board the tram, slipping inside with the others, then rose as one to follow. Maigret entered last, standing near the rear platform, his bulk half hidden by the press of passengers. The tram rattled eastward, its windows fogging faintly with breath. The woman held a strap, her eyes turned toward the window, though she seemed not to see what lay beyond. She rode calmly with the composure of habit, until at Bastille she stepped down, her pace quickening as though now on familiar ground. She walked toward Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, just as Janvier's seamstress had said. Maigret followed at a distance, not close enough to alarm her but near enough to watch her path. She turned into a narrow side street, then stopped before a modest building with worn shutters. A discreet brass plaque near the door announced a notary's office on the first floor. She entered without hesitation. Maigret signaled the others to wait, then stepped inside. The hall smelled of polish and dust. He climbed the stairs slowly, his heavy tread impossible to disguise. The door to the notary's office stood open. Inside, a clerk bent over papers, spectacles sliding down his nose. He looked up with a start at Maigret's imposing figure. "I'm looking for a woman who just came in," Maigret said. The clerk frowned. "Yes, monsieur. She is with Maître Dupont. A private matter. May I—" Before he finished, a door within opened and the woman herself appeared. For a moment her eyes locked with Maigret's, and the color drained from her face. She faltered. The gloves clutched in her hand, then straightened with effort. "Madame," Maigret said quietly, inclining his head. "May we speak?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Together they stepped into the corridor. The notary's clerk watched curiously before returning to his work. They faced each other in the dim stairwell. Maigret's presence filled the narrow space, yet he spoke gently, almost with a kind of weary patience. "You visited him often, you brought him apples. You left no name, no trace. But people remember, madame, they always do. And now you are here in a notary's office. For what? Papers? An inheritance?" Her lips parted as if to answer, then closed again. Her gloved hand tightened on the railing. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. Maigret studied her silently, the pipe idle in his hand. The denial was feeble, a reflex rather than a defense. He let the pause lengthen until she shifted uneasily, then spoke again. "Monsieur Renaud is dead. His room tells little, but it speaks enough. He waited for someone. He arranged his things with care, like a man preparing for a guest. That guest was you, The woman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, resigned. "You have no right," she said softly, "to pry into a life that was not yours." Maigret did not answer at once. He merely looked at her, his gaze steady, not unkind. At last he said, "The dead leave questions. It is my task to listen to them, nothing more." She turned her face away, gazing down the stairwell as if considering escape. But when she spoke again, her voice had softened. "He was not meant to die," she said. "He was meant only to wait, and I—" She broke off, shaking her head. "I cannot explain here." Maigret nodded slightly. "Then come to the quay. Quietly, no fuss. I will listen." For a long moment she stood motionless. Then slowly she replaced her gloves, one finger at a time, her composure returning like a veil. "Tomorrow," she said. "Not today." Maigret accepted this with a grunt, not pressing her further. He stepped aside to let her pass, his eyes following her as she descended. At the doorway she glanced back once, the briefest flicker of something, unreadable in her expression, then vanished into the street. When Maigret rejoined Lucas and Janvier outside, he said nothing at first. Only after lighting his pipe again did he murmur, "She will come, not today, but soon. And when she does, we will learn why a man waited with 2 clocks and nothing else but silence." The others exchanged glances but did not question him. They had learned that Maigret's patience was not idleness, but the slow tightening of a net invisible until it closed. The inspector, for his part, felt the case moving now with the inevitability of a tide. The woman had stepped into the open, and whatever her secret, it would no longer remain hidden. That night Maigret remained later at the quay than he had intended, sitting in his office with the blinds drawn and the ashtray filling steadily beside him. The building was nearly silent, only the occasional footsteps of a guard echoing faintly in the corridor. He kept going back to the woman's face, the way the color had drained when she saw him, the quiet dignity with which she had promised to come tomorrow. It was not the look of guilt alone. It was something heavier, a resignation that suggested she had lived with secrets for a long time. He leaned back, pipe smoke wreathing the ceiling, and considered again the barren room where Renaud had died. The 2 clocks, both ticking yet out of step, seemed to him now less a symbol than a deliberate act, almost like a riddle left behind. A man arranging his death carefully, knowing someone would enter after him, someone who was meant to understand. If she had been the one he waited for, then perhaps the clocks were meant as a message to her. But what message, and why so obscure? When he left the quay after midnight, Paris was damp with a thin mist, the streets shining under the lamps. He walked slower than usual, turning over the possibilities, weighing what was certain against what was speculation. By the time he reached home, Madame Maigret was already asleep. He undressed quietly, slipped into bed, and lay staring into the darkness until fatigue overcame him. The next morning, punctual as always, he was back at the quay. He showed no outward sign of waiting, though his men noticed his pipe was lit. More often, the smoke drifting steadily as the day wore on. He gave out small tasks, checking the notary's records, discreet inquiries into Renaud's past, interviews with neighbors, but all of it circled around the expectation that the woman would arrive. It was late afternoon when the desk sergeant knocked on his door. "A lady to see you, Inspector." Maigret nodded, tamped down his pipe and rose slowly, as though the moment he had anticipated had arrived no sooner than it should. When she entered, she was dressed much the same as before, her gloves immaculate, her manner calm. Yet her eyes betrayed the sleeplessness of a night spent in thought. She sat opposite him, placing her bag neatly on the chair beside her. For a long while neither spoke. Maigret did not hurry her, content to let silence press until words emerged naturally. Finally she drew a slow breath. "My name is Claire Renaud," she said. "I was his wife." The words hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Maigret's heavy lids did not flicker, though inwardly a dozen details rearranged themselves. The fruit vendor's memory of visits, the neighbor's glimpse of her in the corridor, the notary's office, all fell suddenly into a different pattern. "You were estranged?" Maigret asked quietly. She nodded. "For more than 10 years. He was difficult, a man who sought precision in everything, who could not endure disorder. At first it was only in his work, his papers, his accounts. Later it was in life itself. Every gesture had to be measured, every moment planned. There was no room for anything human. Her voice did not tremble, but the way she folded her hands together betrayed the effort of keeping control. I left him. I thought he would let me go, but he never did. Letters came, short, meticulous, almost like reports. He said he forgave me, but he did not. He said he waited for the day I would return, and that when I did, all would be in order again. Maigret leaned forward slightly. And you visited him from time to time? Yes, out of pity perhaps, or guilt. He looked so lost, and yet so proud. I brought him small things, fruit, sometimes bread. But I never stayed. He frightened me, Inspector. Not with violence, he was never violent, but with his obsession. The clocks were the worst. He kept two always in every room, and they were never set to the same time. He said one marked the world as it was, the other as it ought to be. And between them, he said, lay the measure of his suffering. Maigret's pipe had gone out, but he did not relight it. He let her words settle, weighing their strangeness. At last he asked, "And now? Why did you go to the notary?" She looked down, twisting her gloves slowly in her lap. "Because he left everything to me, in his will. I learned of it only yesterday. The notary called me, and I knew I could, no longer avoid the truth. He prepared for his death, Inspector. He wanted it to be my burden." Her voice thickened, and for the first time a tear slipped down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, ashamed. Maigret regarded her with a mixture of pity and detachment. "How you believe he took his own life?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes, who else could have arranged it so carefully?" But Maigret did not answer. In his mind, the scene replayed. The immaculate room, the two clocks, the waiting. It did not feel like suicide, not entirely. Something about the arrangement suggested an audience, an intention to reveal rather than conceal. He leaned back, striking a match and relighting his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his thoughtful face. "Madame," he said slowly, "a man like your husband, precise, deliberate, would not choose to leave questions behind. And yet he has. That troubles me." She lifted her eyes, startled. "You think—" "I think," Maigret interrupted gently, "that death often looks simple when seen from afar. But when one draws close, it is rarely so. Perhaps he chose the manner of it, perhaps not. Perhaps someone helped him, or perhaps someone used his obsessions against him. Until I'm certain, I cannot call it suicide." Claire Renaud pressed her lips together, as though wanting to protest, but unable. She rose after a moment, smoothing her coat. "I have told you what I can. I will not say more. You may think of me what you will." Maigret did not stop her. He only watched as she gathered her bag and gloves, her composure once more intact, and walked out with a faint rustle of fabric. When the door closed behind her, he sat for a long time in silence, smoke drifting around him. At last he murmured, almost to himself, "Two clocks, always out of step. The world as it is, the world as it ought to be. Between them, death." And with that, he knew the investigation had only just begun. Maigret remained seated long after Claire Renaud's departure, his office dim except for the soft glow of the desk lamp and the steady curl of pipe smoke rising into the shadows. He had listened carefully, weighed every word she had chosen, every pause, every glance she avoided. She had not lied outright. He was almost sure of it. Yet truth and honesty were not the same. What she had given him was her version, carefully folded, as though some essential page had been torn away before handing it to him. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The will, the estrangement, the obsessive orderliness, the two clocks, every piece fit neatly, but the whole picture remained unsatisfying. Renaud's death had been arranged to be seen, understood, almost deciphered, yet it was not clear whether he wanted his wife to suffer with guilt, or whether someone else had ensured she would bear the appearance of it. He did not sleep much that night. At home, Madame Maigret left him to his brooding silence, merely setting out supper and shaking, her head at his distracted replies. He lay awake until the small hours, turning the case over in his mind, and when he finally drifted off, it was with the sense that the dead man's shadow had found a way into his dreams. By the next morning, he knew he had to go back to the scene. Not because he expected new evidence, but because the room itself, with its strange, chilling symmetry, might speak differently after hearing Claire's account. He arrived at the Rue Caulaincourt flat just as the concierge was unlocking her small windowed booth. She greeted him warily, a woman who had seen too much in her life to be easily impressed by policemen. "Still locked, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," she said. "No one has been in since." He nodded and climbed the narrow stairs. Inside the apartment, the stillness was oppressive. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a pale strip of daylight. He closed the door softly behind him and stood for a long moment listening. The two clocks ticked steadily but out of phase, each tick slightly off from the other, producing a faint dissonance that filled the silence like two voices murmuring. Without harmony, he moved slowly, circling the table where Renaud had collapsed. The police had cleared away the body, but not the impression of it. On the wall above the mantel, dust marked the outline of frames where pictures had once hung, long since removed. Everything was pared down, deliberate, stripped of excess. Even the books on the shelf, each aligned perfectly, spoke more of calculation than of comfort. He lit his pipe, letting the smoke drift, and lowered himself into the armchair by the window. It was not difficult to imagine Renaud sitting here for hours, listening to the offbeat clocks, staring at the door, waiting for Claire, perhaps. Waiting for something else. Maigret's eyes wandered back to the clocks. He rose, examined them carefully. One was set a few minutes fast, the other a few minutes slow. Nothing unusual in the make or model, ordinary household pieces, neither valuable nor unique. But what troubled him was their positioning. One hung directly above the mantel, the other on the adjacent wall, so that from Renaud's chair he could see both at once without turning his head. Two faces, two measures of time, forcing him always to live in contradiction. The inspector leaned closer. The clocks were both wound, both functional, but then he noticed a small detail. The key for winding was missing. It should have been in the drawer or on the mantel, but it was nowhere in sight. A minor thing, perhaps, yet it unsettled him. Renaud had been precise. He would not have misplaced something so necessary. As he left the apartment, he asked the concierge about the key. She shook her head. He never lent it out. He kept everything to himself. If it's not there, perhaps... He took it with him when... She hesitated, unwilling to finish. The day wore on with little progress. Reports trickled in from his men. The notary confirmed the will written months earlier, leaving everything to Claire. Neighbors remembered Renaud as a solitary figure, polite but distant, never inviting anyone inside. A fruit vendor described the woman visiting occasionally, always dignified, never lingering. All of it reinforced the portrait of obsession and isolation, yet none of it explained why, in the end, death had been staged with such theatrical order. That evening, back in his office, Maigret spread out the notes before him. He struck a match, drew deeply on his pipe and muttered to himself, 2 clocks, 1 life, a man divided, but why leave the division for others to see? Why not end it quietly, in solitude? A knock interrupted him. Lucas entered, hat in hand, his expression curious. "A letter, Chief. Delivered just now, no return address. Thought you'd want to see it." Maigret took the envelope, heavy paper sealed with an unfamiliar crest. He slit it open carefully. Inside, the handwriting was precise, angular, uncannily like the reports Claire had described. The note was brief. "Inspector, do not be misled. Time is never exact. It is always someone's measure, never the truth. Look not at the hours, but at who winds the clock." Maigret sat back, the paper crackling in his hand. His first thought was of Renaud himself, but the letter was freshly written, the ink not yet fully dry. It could not have come from the dead man, and if it was meant to echo his voice, then the sender understood him intimately. Lucas leaned forward. "From her, maybe? The wife?" Maigret shook his head slowly. "No, this is not her hand." Someone else knew him. Someone else was close enough to grasp his obsession. He turned the paper over, but there was no further clue. Only the stark, unsettling words that seemed to pull him deeper into the enigma. Whoever had sent it wanted him to keep questioning, to see beyond the obvious. As the clock in the corridor struck the hour, its chime blending with the city's muted sounds, Maigret realized the case was no longer about whether Renaud had killed himself. It was about understanding the people who lived within the strange rhythm of his divided time, and finding the one who had chosen to keep the clocks ticking after his death. He tamped his pipe, eyes narrowing in thought. Somewhere between those, 2 steady ticks lay the truth, and he would not rest until he had measured it himself. The following morning, Maigret arrived at the quay earlier than usual, the damp air of Paris clinging to his coat and hat. The Seine flowed grey and indifferent beneath the bridges, carrying barges like slow-moving ghosts. He felt the quiet pressure of the previous day's discovery, the letter's cryptic admonition pressing him to act, but carefully with patience. He had learned that in such matters, haste often blurred clarity. Lucas and Janvier were already waiting, each with an uneasy curiosity that Maigret acknowledged only with a slight nod. "We watch today," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it seemed almost a part of the office's dim morning light. "We do not interfere. We see and listen. That will tell us more than any question asked aloud." The 3 of them walked through the streets slowly, letting the rhythm of the city settle over them, noting faces and gestures with the precision of a careful observer. Children hurried past on their way to school, vendors called, and a milk cart rattled over the cobblestones, each sound layering into the dense texture of Parisian life. Maigret inhaled the mixture of damp stone, fresh bread, and coal smoke, letting it anchor him to the reality beneath the abstraction of the investigation. They approached Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where the notary's office had stood, and paused discreetly in the shadow of a narrow doorway. Maigret's eyes scanned the street, noting the angle of windows, the intervals of chimneys, the faint smudge of fingerprints on glass, even from distance. Then he saw her. Claire Renaud emerged from a doorway a few streets away, gloves pristine, shoulders squared, yet there was a faint tension in the way she moved. Maigret gestured slightly, and Lucas and Janvier fell into positions on either side of the street, careful but unobserved. She walked swiftly, deliberately, pausing once to glance behind her, as though sensing a presence she could not see. Maigret observed silently, noting the way her hands flexed around her bag, the careful step that suggested habit and caution alike. When she reached a modest apartment block near a quiet square, she paused again, hesitating at the entry. Maigret's intuition told him that she had expected someone, or that she had thought she would be alone. He motioned for Lucas to wait, and together they approached, keeping to the shadows, making no sudden movements that would alert her. Inside the building, Maigret trailed just behind, his eyes always on her. She climbed the stairs slowly, as if weighing each step, then paused at the 3rd floor. A door opened, and a man appeared briefly, a figure Maigret did not recognize, exchanging a quiet word with Claire before she disappeared inside. Maigret noted the man carefully. Short, neat, unremarkable in appearance, yet there was a precision in his movements that suggested familiarity, a calm certainty. They waited a long while outside, listening to the faint murmur of voices behind the closed door. Finally, the door opened again, and Claire emerged alone carrying a small bundle of papers. She moved with deliberate composure, as though rehearsed, yet Maigret saw the imperceptible trembling of her hands beneath her gloves. They followed at a distance, through streets that were still wet from morning mist until she paused outside a small cafe near the river. She entered, hesitated, then seated herself at a table in the corner, her eyes scanning the room carefully. Maigret and his men watched from across the street, noting each gesture. The way she straightened the tablecloth, adjusted her bag, and finally exhaled, as if she had carried a weight until now. Inside the cafe, she unfolded the bundle of papers. Maigret could not read the contents, but the way she handled them, turning each sheet slowly, sometimes pausing to press a fingertip against the margin, suggested letters, perhaps invoices, perhaps the will itself. the documents that bound her to Renault even now. He made a mental note of the careful attention she paid, the ritualistic precision that mirrored the man she had once visited. Hours passed with minimal movement. Maigret observed without interruption, allowing the scene to unfold. The barista moved behind the counter. The door opened periodically. Strangers came and went, yet Claire remained at her corner, lost in contemplation. She sipped from a cup of coffee, her eyes never leaving the papers, as though measuring the weight of each word against the man who had left her this inheritance and this mystery. Finally, she rose, folded the documents with meticulous care, and left the café. Maigret signaled to Lucas and Janvier. They followed, keeping the distance that preserved observation without interference. Claire moved toward Rue Saint-Louis-en-Lille, as though drawn by a memory, until she paused outside Renault's former building. She did not enter. Instead, she stood, hands resting lightly on the railing, and looked up at the windows where the two clocks had ticked silently for so long. Maigret remained behind the corner, observing. The pause was brief, but it was enough. A half-smile flickered across her face, almost imperceptible, a private acknowledgement of the life that had been lived and the death that had followed. She placed her hand over the small bundle, pressed it against her chest, then turned and walked. Away her steps measured, leaving the building and its secrets undisturbed. Maigret let the moment linger, inhaling the damp air of the street, the faint smell of bread from the corner bakery mixing with the river's scent. The scene had revealed what no questioning could. She had loved him, feared him, yet respected the order he demanded even in death. And yet there remained a question, a quiet, persistent dissonance of who had written the letter, of who had left the reminder that time is never exact, that someone always winds the clock. He turned back toward the quay with Lucas and Janvier. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the cobblestones, and the city had a slow, deliberate rhythm. Maigret's thoughts were not hurried. They never were. He considered the woman's visits, the careful acts of devotion and fear, the absence of her name in the records, the persistence of 2 clocks out of step. Everything pointed to a man who measured life meticulously, and a woman who had learned to navigate his measurements without breaking them. Back at the office, Maigret sat alone, spreading out the documents he had collected from the notary and the letters Claire had brought indirectly to his attention. He examined them slowly, drawing connections, noting discrepancies, considering the hands that had touched each sheet. There was nothing overt, nothing dramatic, yet the sum of the small details formed a quiet picture of intimacy, fear, and deliberate concealment. At last, he leaned back in his chair, pipe extinguished, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He murmured to himself, almost softly. The man measured the hours, the woman measured her steps, and the city measured nothing at all. But in the end we always see. The office grew dim as the evening settled, but Maigret remained, patient and unhurried. He understood now that the revelation would not come in a confrontation, not in a dramatic confession, but in observation, in the small slips of habit, in the quiet acknowledgement of presence and absence. He had witnessed the truth in the spaces, between gestures in the rhythm of footsteps and the alignment of clocks, in the careful folding of papers and the weight of silence. The case would reach its resolution quietly, as all such cases did in his experience. And when it did, Maigret would know that justice, understanding, and human nature had been measured in equal parts, subtle, deliberate, and inexorably complete. The following morning, Paris had that soft, indifferent light that made the wet streets shine like polished slate. Maigret walked slowly, deliberately along the quay, the pipe in his hand unlit, his thoughts in motion. Claire Renault had returned as promised, calm, collected, yet carrying the quiet weight of her past with her. The documents she had brought were modest, but in their details lay the careful measures of a life lived under observation and control. He had spent the previous night reviewing every note, every letter, every small discrepancy. The letter that had arrived without a sender, the clocks frozen yet wound, the precise yet inconsistent movements of those who had entered Renault's life, All suggested a narrative that was less about crime than about human obsession and its quiet consequences. When Claire arrived, Maigret greeted her with a nod, inviting her to sit in his office. She placed her bag and gloves carefully beside her, the ritual of composure intact, but her eyes betrayed the faint tremor of relief. She had come to face the story she had avoided, and he had come to understand it without accusation. "Madame," Maigret began softly, "I have seen enough now to understand. Monsieur Renault's death was arranged by him, yes, but not in solitude. He allowed you to witness the consequence of his obsession without involving you directly. And yet someone else intervened in subtle ways, letters, messages, reminders that echoed his intentions, ensuring his private order remained intact even after he was gone." Claire looked down, pressing her gloved hands together. "You mean someone was guiding me or testing me?" Maigret nodded slowly. "Perhaps both. The letters, the small details, the arrangements, it was all designed to measure patience, compassion, and understanding. And you passed, madame. You returned when expected, but on your own terms. You respected his world without becoming its prisoner." She exhaled, a faint smile flickering. "So he trusted me, even in death." Maigret leaned back, letting the silence stretch. The office felt heavy, but in that weight there was clarity. The mystery was not one of malicious crime, but of human complexity, of pride, loneliness, and careful devotion. The clocks, the letters, the daily habits, they were not puzzles to solve, but lives to understand. He finally said, "There is nothing more to chase here. The world he left was measured, but it was never cruel. You may now take what is yours, not with guilt, but with recognition of the life that was lived and the love that existed quietly beneath it." Claire nodded, tears brimming but contained, and rose. "Thank you, Inspector, for seeing everything." Maigret watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. The city stretched beyond the window, indifferent yet intimate, alive in small gestures. The clatter of a baker's cart, the cry of a street hawker, the distant chime of a bell. He returned to his chair, lit his pipe, and exhaled slowly. The two clocks had been accounted for, returned to their places in the apartment, silent witnesses to what had passed. The letters remained in careful files, not evidence but a record of human measurement. There would be no arrests, no confessions shouted in the night, only the quiet understanding that people live in ways that are at once ordinary and extraordinary, and that even in death, some lives leave their traces in the smallest, most deliberate acts. Maigret leaned back, eyes fixed on the muted street. Outside, rain began again, lightly, the soft tapping on the pavement mingling with the pulse of the city. He sipped his coffee, the heat rising against the cool Parisian morning. And as he sat in silence, he understood fully what he had always known. Human nature is rarely spectacular, often contradictory, but always revealed in the subtleties of daily life, in the gestures, the hesitations, and the quiet courage of those who measure their steps carefully through the world. He exhaled, letting the smoke drift toward the ceiling, and murmured to himself, "Time is never exact, but understanding can be." The case was closed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of one who has observed, waited, and finally comprehended. The streets continued their soft, damp rhythm, the city alive around him, carrying the weight of countless unseen lives, each measured in its own slow, deliberate way. Maigret leaned back further, letting the rain and the city lull him into thought. And in that moment, he found the resolution not in revelation or spectacle, but in the simple truth. Some mysteries are solved not by force, but by patient observation, by presence, and by understanding the human heart. The clocks ticked on, as they always had, and he smiled faintly, content that time itself had revealed its own measure.